June 8th of 2021, the investigation into the horrific scene at the Murdaugh kennels begins. Family and friends gather at the Moselle property to comfort Alex, as the murder of his wife and son become front page news. At 5 a.m., just a few miles away, Rogan Gibson wakes up to a series of missed calls, and upon returning them, he hears the news that his best friend, Paul, was shot and killed. As he hurries to the scene, and unbeknownst to him at the time, is that what lies within his cell phone is the key piece of evidence in what will become the most talked about trial of the decade. Welcome to Exposed, Scandalous Files of the Elite, Murdaugh, Episode 4, Big Red. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Exposed, Scandalous Files of the Elite. I am your host, Jim Chapman, and quickly before we get into today's episode, I want to shout out and thank all of the Patreon supporters. I say it all the time, but we could not do this show without you. I love every single one of you for supporting me, and if you can't be a patron, I get it. Totally understand. Other great ways to support the show, please just share it on your social media. And lastly, if you haven't had the opportunity to provide a review, please do so. It takes literally like 10 seconds. Just go to whatever podcast platform you are currently listening on and leave a review. One word is all it takes, but it really helps run that show up the rankings, which Google likes that, and it shows it to other people when you do it. I would really appreciate that. The more success we have, the more episodes we can drop. And speaking of that, we're going to be dropping 2 episodes a week for a while, probably through at least the new year. And we may even go to 3 if we see enough success when dropping 2 episodes. So you can look for the Murdaugh series to drop every Tuesday and a regular episode of Exposed Scandalous Files of the Elite to drop every Thursday. If there's something crazy that happens in the world, we may drop an episode before Thursday for regular Exposed. For example, we just dropped the Diddy arrest. Whoop, whoop. Look, y'all, 6 episodes in and he got arrested. And I told y'all that was going to happen. Over the moon over that guy getting arrested. Finally, all these victims are going to get some form of justice, with Diddy probably never getting out of jail. That's my prediction. I think he's locked up and he will continue to be locked up. Look forward to that. 2 episodes a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays on Exposed. And today we are dropping episode 4 of Murdaugh, and I'm going to call this episode Big Red. So the last time I left you with episode 3, police, they were at those kennels, right? They're gathering evidence, they're securing that scene, and they had conducted the first interview of Alex Murdaugh, which I played you. And so the investigation into the murders of Paul and Maggie Murdaugh had begun. And when you look at these cases, you start from the inside out. You go to the closest people to the situation. Always you go to the first person that found the victims, and then you kind of go backwards from there. That's how you work these crimes. And police had started that process, but what did they think so far? What was the scene itself like through the eyes of law enforcement that were right there on that scene? So I'm going to reference a couple of investigative reports that I have from that night. And I'm going to start with the report of Captain J.W. Chapman. No relation to myself, but he is a captain in the Colleton County Sheriff's Office. And his report states, on June 7th, 2021 at 22:07 hours, and that's 10:07 p.m., y'all, I heard the Colleton County Dispatch Center giving out a call of 2 people shot at 4147 Moselle Road. I immediately sent notification out to detectives. At 22:19, 10:19 p.m., I checked on duty and en route to the call. While en route, I was advised by Sheriff Hill that the caller was Alex Murdaugh and the deceased parties were reported as his family members. Sheriff Hill stated that once we assessed the scene, he would likely call SLED for assistance. The first unit, Sergeant Daniel Green, arrived on scene at 22:26 hours, 10:26. I contacted Sergeant Green via radio and expressed I wanted to secure the crime scene with only essential personnel. I arrived at the scene around 22:37 hours. I turned on a dirt driveway with a mailbox marked 4147. Approximately 375 feet down, the driveway split and circled a large shed. Road Patrol had already taped off the scene and were controlling the entry points. The inner perimeter was empty of individuals and personnel with the exception of the Colleton County Sheriff Office units, which were Sergeant Green, Deputy Buford McDowell, and Deputy William Pruitt. Colleton County Fire Rescue Chief Barry McRoy had already done a visual assessment and requested the coroner. Sergeant Green advised that he had a camouflage shotgun secured in his vehicle that was surrendered by the caller upon Green's arrival. It was starting to rain, and I advised Lieutenant David Long to pick up a tent on the way to the scene. The body of an adult male was observed face down in an open doorway to a feed room that was positioned at the end of a long run of dog kennels. The male, identified by the caller as Paul Murdaugh. The male's feet were just inside the plane of the door, with the remainder of the body stretched out the door, across a small concrete sidewalk and onto the gravel driveway. The male was covered by a pink sheet placed there by Colleton County personnel. The sheet was raised briefly for the purpose of determining if a firearm was visible or on or near the body. Paul had on a t-shirt, shorts, and shoes. His hands were underneath his body. Paul had a traumatic open wound to the head, and the majority of Paul's brain was lying on the ground to his left side. There were also pieces of his skull cap on the ground. Additionally, there were high-velocity blood splatter on the upper half of the open door and ceiling area just inside the doorway. 4 to 5 holes were also visible in the window in the opposite end of the feed room that appeared to be new damage. An Apple iPhone was lying on top of Paul's body. The phone did not appear to have any blood on it, and the screen was blank. The body of an adult female was observed face down near the edge of a large covered shed. Her head was pointed toward the direction of the dog kennels, and she was approximately 30 feet from Paul's body. She was identified by the caller as Maggie Murdaugh. Maggie was wearing a blue patterned romper and shoes. She too had traumatic head injury, along with what appeared to be gunshot wounds to the upper right back, lower left back, and right leg. There was a small piece of brain matter a few feet from her head and 2 large clumps of hair on her right side. Colleton County Fire Rescue also placed a pink sheet over Maggie's body. Next to Maggie's body and strewn along the gravel driveway between Maggie and Paul were multiple large caliber rifle casings. With no weapon visible, evidence supporting that both victims were shot and or killed by gunfire, and confirmation from caller Alex Murdaugh that the deceased were his family. Detective Laura Rutland from the Colleton County Sheriff's Office was rerouted and instructed to obtain a search warrant for the location. Lieutenant Long arrived on the scene and a tent was placed over Maggie's body to preserve the evidence from the rain. Deputy Pruitt maintained a crime scene log while other deputies assisted with holding the crime scene perimeter. Once SLED personnel arrived on scene, they were briefed on the circumstances and the fact that the search warrant process was already underway. Detective Rutland arrived on the scene with a signed search warrant prior to the arrival of the SLED crime scene units. Detective Rutland was assigned as a liaison to assist SLED in the investigation. A portion of the 911 call was played for the agents to hear, and Rutland and Special Agent David Owens then conducted an interview of Alex Murdaugh. The interview was conducted inside Special Agent Owens' vehicle due to the rain. When other personnel arrived, Detective Rutland and I assisted in processing the scene. A shotgun taken from Alex by responding deputies was turned over to CSU technicians, crime scene unit. With Paul's body, I had observed at least 2 gunshot wounds. Blood patterns on the wall of the feed shed and projectile trajectory indicated that Paul was standing when he sustained both shots. One trajectory path suggests an upward pattern, and one suggested straight through the feed room and exited through the rear window. Buckshot was located in the pine trees along the rear of the shed. Paul's phone was lying on top of his buttocks, and there was no signs of a weapon around the body or shed. 2 spent 12-gauge shell casings were also located near the body. Near Paul was an indentation in the ground, characteristic of a projectile impact. Eventually, a rifle projectile was located in the dirt of the impression. Multiple 300 blackout spent casings were located between Paul's body and Maggie's body. There were also several near and underneath Maggie's body, and Maggie appeared to have several gunshot wounds, including one to the lower leg and one to the back of the head area. At least one impact from a rifle round was found in the side wall of an enclosed barn adjacent to the bodies, and at least one rifle round was dug out of a nearby dog kennel. There was a clear set of tire impressions passing underneath the cover portion of the barn toward the road. These tracks were later determined to belong to a caretaker that was feeding the dogs earlier that day. On the opposite side of the enclosed barn was a pattern of small shoe impressions, characteristic of flats or flip-flops. The impressions appeared to have been pacing the barn wall. Paul's truck was parked 40 to 60 yards away, adjacent to a separate tractor shed. Maggie's vehicle was not observed at the scene, and Alex was driving his Chevrolet Suburban. Scene integrity was maintained well into the daylight hours as crime scene unit technicians processed, and the crime scene was never compromised. The scene was eventually released by SLED, and Colleton County Sheriff's Office personnel were cleared. Items of evidence mentioned in this report were based on visual observations only. SLED crime scene unit collected all evidence, and Colleton County Sheriff's Office detectives, including myself, merely assisted. Exact number, descriptions, measurements, and or identification of potential evidence should be deducted from SLED crime scene unit reports only. And that is his report, that being Captain J.W. Chapman. And another report that I'm going to reference is from Detective Laura Rutland. Now, Laura Rutland, if you'll remember from episode 3, conducted that first interview with Alex Murdaugh along with SLED's Detective Owen inside Detective Owen's vehicle. And here are her thoughts of the scene and a summary of that interview with Alex. She says, Monday, June 7th, 2021 at 22:11 hours, I, Detective Rutland, was notified of a death scene with 2 victims at 4147 Moselle Road. I first responded to the Colleton County Sheriff's Office headquarters to prepare a search warrant for SLED to process the location of the scene. After preparing the search warrant, I met with Magistrate Judge Duffy, who granted the search of the property And upon my arrival at the incident location, which was near the dog kennels and large outbuildings for storing farm equipment and property on Moselle Road, I observed several law enforcement personnel from Colleton County Sheriff's Office and SLED on the scene. I met with my supervisor, Captain Chapman, who informed me that SLED would be the lead agency on this case and assigned me as a liaison from the Colleton County Sheriff's Office to assist SLED lead senior special agent David Owen. I then partnered with Agent Owen and we walked the crime scene. The scene was marked by crime scene tape and was secured by multiple deputies. I observed a deceased white male lying face down at an angle away from the buildings. His feet were in the doorway to a storage room attached at the end of the dog kennels, and his body was outside the room laying across the outside concrete pad. His arms were underneath his body. There was no weapon by the body. The body was covered by a sheet. Wadding to a shotgun shell was observed behind the deceased's feet inside the shed. And let me tell you real quick what wadding is in case you're not familiar. In a shotgun, you have, picture a shotgun shell. You have the plastic part of that shotgun shell, for lack of a better word. And then you have the brass at the top. And that brass at the top contains the gunpowder that when a pin hits that gunpowder, it hits that strike, it then forces the pellets out of the shotgun shell, where there's a wadding that also flies out when that shotgun shell is fired. And it's basically like packing. Think of it like packing for those shotgun pellets. And that wadding comes out with the pellets, but it doesn't go very far. It only goes like 3 feet and then it falls to the ground. And of course the pellets just continue on. She observed that wadding by Paul's feet. A rear window to the shed had several holes in the glass. Large amounts of blood spatter and brain/skull matter were on the door to the shed and on items within the storage building. I observed a pool of blood all around his head, and he had a large opening where the top of his head was, exposing the entire intracranial cavity. His brain was next to his body near his legs. The deceased female was approximately 20 to 30 feet, and she's estimating, from the male's body, located at the end of the carport section of a large workshop-type building. The female was face down, also with her arms and hands underneath her body. She had an obvious gunshot wound to her head. There was a large hole in the back of her head and wounds to her back and legs. There was a large pool of blood underneath her head. There were no weapons near her body. I learned the bodies were identified by 911 caller Alex Murdaugh as his son, Paul Murdaugh, and his wife, Maggie Murdaugh. And then she references the interview with Alex Murdaugh. This is a summary. Please refer to the body camera and report of Agent Owen, she says. And that's all she has on that. And of course, she says refer to the body camera and the report of Agent Owen to ascertain what occurred. And I played you that entire interview the last episode, so we won't go into that any further. Now, let me tell you about Rogan Gibson. So Rogan Gibson grew up in Hampton County. He went to Wade Hampton High School. He was best friends with Paul. They had been best friends since they were 11 years old, but they knew each other their entire life. They were just really tight after the age of 11. He was very mature for his age. He was 22 when Paul was murdered. But to give you an example of how mature he was, at just 22 years old, he was foreman of an agricultural business inside of Hampton County. So he was leading other people, even at that age. And he got up really early, like 5 o'clock almost every day. I mean, when you're in that business, when you're working outside, you're in agriculture, that's when you're up, when the sun comes up, right? But 22 years old, he's waking up at like 5 o'clock every morning. So, you know, he's not going out partying every night and all these sorts of things. There is no way I was that responsible at that age. 5 o'clock in the morning, I didn't see often unless I hadn't went to bed yet at 22 years old. So he was just a really sharp, well-mannered young man who was also the last person to speak to Paul alive and was the person who carried the most critical information, bar none, in this entire case. Without Rogan and the evidence that he supplied, this case would have never been adjudicated. I can promise you that. But we'll get to that later on. Now, as you can imagine, Rogan, he was like a third son to Alex and Maggie Murdaugh. Just always around, y'all. Took trips with them to their Edisto beach house, Murdaugh Island, if you'll remember from past episodes. I told you about that. He even referred to Alex Murdaugh with a nickname, and his nickname for Alex Murdaugh was Big Red. So on the morning of the 8th, just a few hours outside of the murder of his best friend, Rogan ended up in the car of the detective on this case, and he had quite the story to tell. Now, Rogan's dog, a chocolate lab named Cash, he was being housed at the kennels. He was just a puppy at the time. And Rogan was living with his girlfriend at the time, and they didn't allow pets in the apartment where they were living. So he housed Cash at the Moselle kennels after asking Alex Murdaugh, Big Red, if that was okay. And Alex Murdaugh, he was happy to do so. This kid was like a son to him. So on June 7th of 2021, he gets a call, and it's 8:40 p.m. from Paul, and it lasts about 4 minutes. And on this call, Paul asked him if there's something wrong with Cash's tail. Now, I've not mentioned this until now, but it's believed that Maggie and Paul were murdered sometime around 8:50. So just 10 minutes after he had talked to Paul on the telephone, 6 minutes after he hung up with him, they're estimating. So Rogan tells Paul he's not real sure, what's going on with his dog's tail. He says, text me a picture and let me have a look. And Paul says, I'll tell you what, I'll FaceTime you. But they're out in the country, y'all. Service is not like it is, in a big city. And it really was not great at the Moselle property. And Paul, knowing that may be an issue, a FaceTime, says, look, if it doesn't work, I'll take a video and then I will text it to you. So they try FaceTime, but it has a bunch of lag. Think about when you've tried to FaceTime people and you're in a bad area. It's just really sketchy. You can't hear what they're saying. They sound like a robot. The video's lagging really bad. So Paul says, look, I'm going to take a video and call you back, basically. Hangs up, and Rogan waits to get that video text. He would never get it. So Rogan waits, and then he shoots Paul a couple of texts, one at 8:49 p.m., just 6 minutes after he hung up the phone. And then another at 9:58 p.m. And he made several calls at 9:10 p.m., 9:29 p.m., 9:42 p.m., and 9:57 p.m. And even another at 10:08 p.m. He even texted Maggie Murdaugh, and his text said, have Paul call me. That was at 9:34 p.m. Of course, neither would ever respond. Although he would say on record later on that if Paul had his phone, he always responded to text, and most times would answer the phone if he was able, but always responded to text saying he's busy or whatever if he couldn't call somebody right back. So Rogan goes to bed around 10:15 that night. And he wakes up around 5 o'clock the next morning, and he sees he has 2 missed calls from Alex Murdaugh. One at 10:21 p.m. the night before and one at 10:24 p.m. the night before. And he notices a missed call from a mutual friend of him and Paul's, and that guy's name was Nolan. And Nolan, interestingly enough, was also a police officer. So he calls Nolan first, and Nolan tells him that his best friend in the whole world had been murdered. So he does what you think he would do. He handles things with regard to work really, really fast. Hey, I got an emergency. My friend's been killed, whatever. And he goes to Moselle to find out what's going on. And he brings his cousin with him. But the scene, it's frantic, right? Now you've got a bunch of people at the house. It's a bunch of family, a bunch of lawyers, a bunch of old people, quite frankly, in his mind. I mean, he's 22 years old. And Alex was absolutely in pieces. He's never seen Alex like this. So he's feeling a little out of place. He doesn't really know how to act in that situation. So I'm sure he thinks to himself, I need to just get my dog and go home, and I'll come back later when things settle down. So he does. He goes to the kennels and he grabs cash and he heads home. And I'm sure he was just horrified. I mean, you go to those kennels and, you know, blood's still around. The bodies aren't there, but the scene is still there. And I'm sure he was just heartbroken at what he saw. But he grabs his dog. He heads home. But before he goes home, he stops at a convenience store just outside of Moselle. And he runs into a game warden. Guy had his whole game warden uniform on. And he asks the guy, do you have any details on what happened at Moselle? And the game warden talks to him for a few minutes, and he realizes that Rogan is Paul's best friend. And Rogan mentions, man, I just talked to him. Do you know when this happened? Because I just talked to him at 8:40 that night. So the game warden's talking back and forth to Paul, and he figures out, whoa, this is appears to be the last guy probably to talk to Paul before he was killed. So he tells Rogan, hey man, law enforcement is going to want to talk to you. And Rogan responds with, hey, if you got a contact, let them know I'm right here, right now at this convenience store, and I'll tell them anything they want to know. So that's what happened. And he sits at the convenience store with the game warden, and they're waiting for the detectives to show up. So Jeff Croft and Katie McAllister, which were two detectives working on the case, they show up, and he tells them everything I just told you. He gives them screenshots of the text, that him and Paul have made to each other. He shows them his call log on his phone of the missed calls, everything. So I want you to listen to this. Now, it's heavily redacted, but it's about 3 minutes of a police interview, that actual interview that Rogan Gibson gave inside the detective's car at that convenience store on the morning of June 8th, 2021. And here's what that sounded like.
And
you got a dog, you got
chocolate lab.
Gotcha.
And he called me. I looked at my phone. It was 8:44 last night. And he said,
when you say he, who?
Paul.
Okay.
And he
said, talk to us like we don't know anything.
Yeah, you got to give us names.
Okay. So Paul,
because when you say he, I might not know who you're talking about. I want to make sure I get it right. Okay.
Paul called me
at what time?
At 8:44.
Okay.
PM. And said that there was something wrong with my dog. And I said, well, send me a picture of it. He said, well, I'll try to FaceTime you. FaceTime me. I seen a little bit of the screen. He said, I don't think I got connection. He said, I'll send you a picture or video of it. During the conversation with him, I heard Miss Maggie and believed to be what was Mr. Elliott in the background. Can't swear that it was Mr. Elliott, but I believe it was Mr. Elliott.
How well do you know Mr. Elliott?
I'm like a third son of them.
So you would recognize his voice pretty
Yeah, I'm 99% sure that was Mr. Elliott talking to me.
Okay.
Or talking to them while I was on the phone.
Okay.
And after then, I waited for the picture, never got him, called him back a couple times, never heard from him. And I'm guessing that's when it happened, sometime between the time I talked to him at 8:44 and
that. Were they arguing? Were they?
They were talking about my dog and said there was a little knot on his tail.
Okay.
And they wanted me to know if I was going to come pick him up.
That's what Alex was talking about?
Alex was just saying that I think his tail's broke. That's what I heard the male voice say.
I got you.
Which I think was Mr. Alex.
I got you.
Miss Maggie was asking, does she need to give him some medicine?
Okay.
And I said, no. I said, if he acts like he's fine, don't give him no medicine. I'll have my cousin come check him out because we live right here in this area. And I was going to get my cousin to come check him out this morning.
Okay.
And
did you ever talk to Maggie or Mr. Alex?
Never did while I was on the phone with Paul and Maggie.
Does the phone go dead or you just never got the picture?
Never got the picture. He hung up after he tried to FaceTime me because he was going to show me the little knot on the dog's tail.
Correct.
Which I think is just a little insect bite. But he did FaceTime me and I seen the background was the dog kennels.
Okay.
And then he said, I don't have connection because, when you get on FaceTime, you don't have connection. It's kind of lagging a little bit.
Sir.
Screen kind of moves around real slow.
Yes, sir.
That's what was going on and he hung up.
Okay.
It didn't sound like there was no failure to the call. It just went blank. Just never heard anything from him.
Okay. And you said you tried to call him back?
I tried to call him back a couple times.
From your cell phone?
Yeah, sir.
30.
Did you hear that shit? You heard it right. During that 4-minute conversation, in the background, Rogan was 99% sure he heard Alex Murdaugh in the background talking. Well, that's a direct contradiction to what Alex's story was, right? He never went to the kennels, according to his story. Not only that, but if they got killed around 8:50 and he hears Alex's voice around 8:44, what the fuck? Well, at the end of the day, you need proof he was at those kennels. Although Rogan said, hey, I'm 99% sure that sounded like Alex's voice, he could possibly be wrong. No way to prove that anyway in a court of law, right? Well, we'll get into that later. So now that police know this, and they heard that it's very likely Alex was at those kennels shortly before his wife and son were killed, they know they may have something, but they got to tread lightly. They got to get as much hard evidence as possible. Remember who this is. This is Alex Murdaugh of the all-powerful Murdaugh family, a family full of lawyers. One mistake could cost them the case, right? So investigate they do. And in the meantime, just 3 days after the murders, on June 10th, this happens. Former 14th Circuit Solicitor Randolph Murdaugh III dies at home. And I'm going to reference the article. A longtime 14th Circuit solicitor, a member of the prominent Murdaugh family of Hampton County, and partner in one of the largest law firms in South Carolina, has died today, June 10th, at the age of 81. The Peters, Murdaugh, Parker, and Dietrich law firm of Hampton, founded by Murdaugh's grandfather more than 100 years ago, posted the following message on its Facebook page at 5:20 p.m. We are sad to announce the passing of Randolph Murdaugh III. Please continue to keep the Murdaugh family in your thoughts and prayers. Murdaugh died at home Thursday afternoon after suffering from extended health problems, confirmed by Hampton County Coroner Angie Topper. Hampton Funeral Home Director Gordon Roden, who is handling the funeral arrangements for the family, said the arrangements are incomplete at this time. Murdaugh is the grandfather of Paul Murdaugh and father-in-law to Margaret Murdaugh, who were both killed on June 7th in a double homicide at their home in Colleton County that is still under investigation with no arrest reported. His death comes just one day after Paul and Margaret's scheduled funerals at noon on Friday of this week. On September 20th, 2018, Murdaugh III joined the ranks of such South Carolina icons as the late novelist Pat Conroy, civil rights activist Septina Clark, and Carolina football coach Lou Holtz, as well as singer James Brown, in receiving the Order of the Palmetto. The Order of the Palmetto is the highest civilian honor awarded by the governor of South Carolina. Established in 1971 and first awarded to Governor John C. West, it recognizes a person's lifetime achievements and contributions to the state of South Carolina. I want to thank you all for coming here and thank the governor for this honor, Murdaugh said at the time. There may be people in South Carolina more deserving, but nobody is more appreciative than I am. And it goes on to describe a lot of his achievements, but we've been through a lot of that. You know, obviously a very prominent family. So the day after that, on the 11th of June, Paul and Maggie Murdaugh are laid to rest. And I do have Paul Murdaugh's obituary. I'll read that to you real quick. It says Paul Murdaugh, April 14th, 1999 to June 7th of 2021. Paul Terry Murdaugh, 22, of Hampton, South Carolina, entered eternal rest alongside his loving mother, Margaret Branstetter Murdaugh, known as Maggie, the evening of Monday, June 7th, 2021. Paul grew up with a love for the outdoors and particularly enjoyed hunting at their lodge in Moselle with his father, Alex, and brother, Buster. He was a junior at the University of South Carolina, where he was often found cheering on the Gamecocks with his friends and family. Paul never met a stranger and had an abundance of friends. He was always eager to lend a helping hand to anyone in need. No one was more loving and genuine than Paul, and because of this, his personality was one of a kind. Paul is survived by his beloved father, Richard Alexander Murdaugh, Alex, and his older brother, Richard Alexander Murdaugh Jr., Buster, both of whom he looked up to with all his heart. Paul is survived by his maternal grandparents, Terry Lee Branstetter and Kennedy Hubbard Branstetter, and his paternal grandparents, Randolph Murdaugh III and Elizabeth Alexander Murdaugh. His uncles, Randolph Murdaugh IV and John Marvin Murdaugh, his aunts, Marion Branstetter Proctor, Lynn Murdaugh Goat, and many cousins. The graveside service celebrating the lives of Paul and Maggie will be held on Friday, June 11th at 12 o'clock at Hampton Cemetery. And there you have it. So, look, Paul Murdaugh, and, you know, I was hard on him, and deservedly so, in the first episode of this series. He was an asshole. He beat on women. I'm sorry. I don't like that. He smacked the shit out of his girlfriend several times, and this was a ongoing thing with him. He also, due to his stupidity and bad decisions, killed somebody in a boat wreck, a beautiful young lady. I have no sympathy for things like that, but I will tell you that regardless of those things, nobody deserves to be murdered. And he was. And he deserves justice, just like his victims deserved justice. So they're trying to seek it, right, in South Carolina, even against this powerful family. Now we're on the 11th, and wow, how much can one family take, right? Paul and Maggie are murdered on the 7th. On the 10th, Paul's grandfather, Alex's father, dies. And on the 11th, they lay Maggie and Paul to rest, and police are investigating, and they don't know, but they already have sort of an inclination that maybe Alex Murdaugh is tied up in this somehow. Now, one of the people that Alex Murdaugh mentioned, I believe it was in episode 3 when he did that interview inside of the car with Detective Owen, was a guy by the name of C.B. Rowe. So I got curious and I did, I guess, some investigating of C.B. Rowe and started looking up information about him. And let's talk about him real quick. So C.B. Rowe, he was hired by Alex Murdaugh to help maintain the grounds of that Moselle property. It was a big hunting property, right? 1,700 acres. You got to have people maintaining that. He was born in 1957. And he received a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry and Environmental Science from Charleston Southern and was a chemistry teacher at Thomas Hayward Academy. This was in Ridgeland, South Carolina. But he was fired in 2010 for having an inappropriate relationship with a student. To go into more detail on that, he was arrested and charged with sexual battery of a student in Jasper County. He pled guilty in Jasper County Circuit Court in 2011, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but the sentence was suspended, the entire sentence of 5 years, and he was placed on probation by Judge Carmen Mullen. That in and of itself is crazy to me. He did absolutely no jail time. Now, if you'll remember, Murdaugh claimed that Rowe had killed a field of sunflowers that he had planted with Paul on June 7th. And interestingly enough, when they went through the cell phone reports of Alex Murdaugh, Rowe called Murdaugh during his drive to his parents' home that day on June 7th or that evening. But at the time, Murdaugh was on the phone with his attorney, Chris Wilson, and told Rowe, look, I'm going to have to call you back. So I went back and I got more curious about that sexual relationship case that he had, those charges and eventual conviction. And the only thing that I could really find is an article I'm just going to reference real quick from what's known as Bluffington Today. And it says a former Thomas Haywood Academy teacher was charged with having an inappropriate relationship with a student and was sentenced to probation in court last week. Claude B. Rowe III, 53, was arrested and charged with sexual battery of a student for holding hands and kissing a 16-year-old girl at the school. He pleaded guilty in circuit court and was sentenced to 5 years probation, but the sentence was suspended to 5 years probation. The girl's parents reported the allegations to the Jasper County Sheriff's Office, and Rowe later resigned. According to the girl's statement to investigators, the teen and Rowe, who taught environmental science and chemistry at the private high school, held hands, kissed, and had conversations at the school on the phone and by text. When she was interviewed, the girl told deputies she had a relationship with Rowe, but there was no force or coercion involved. He was charged under a new state law that makes such relationships illegal when a student and teacher are involved. Because of her age, the girl and the parents were not identified. Now, it's also interesting to bring up that when C.B. Rowe's name came out, there were a lot of people, and we're going to get deeper into this, but I'll just let you chew on it or think about it for a minute. Because there was 2 weapons involved, and that is so strange, a lot of people thought, well, if Alex Murdaugh had something to do with this, he had to have an accomplice, especially with the fact that there were 2 weapons. And there were a lot of people that thought that C.B. Rowe was that accomplice. And as we go into the case, maybe there's some more details I'll have for you on that. So stay tuned. Other rumors outside of the C.B. Rowe stuff, they really start flying, and they really started flying the second that all of this got out with the double murder at Moselle, not only locally in South Carolina, but nationally. And many people, for the very first time, hear the name Stephen Smith. Who is Stephen Smith? And what significance does he have to this case? Well, I'll answer that question in the next episode. Thank you so much for listening. And until next time, for Exposed, Scandalous Files of the Elite, I'm Jim Chapman. Much love.